I am enjoying my life. I'm really enjoying it now. This morning was an extra special blessing, obviously, to be here and dedicating one of my granddaughters. You know, I have 5 granddaughters. Talk about a blessing, and a grandson. So I'm really blessed, and I am enjoying every moment of time now, even more than I have as life has been. Stresses. We've all had stress in it, but I'm really enjoying it. Now, in the mid 1380s, if you go back that far, that's like 700 years ago, Geoffrey Chaucer, you've heard that name. Maybe you haven't heard this. He said in his famous romantic poem called Troilus and Cressida, he said these words: "All good things must come to an end." And I was just having such a good time. And unfortunately, it seems like truer words were never spoken, right? How many good times have we had? And, we've been places and we always know, well, got to go back to work. We got to go home and clean up that mess now. Got to do things that are not as much fun. And so it does seem that this is true, that all good things must come to an end. Except for this one rather important statement that was made. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies. Just pause and think about that statement. One with which I'm sure just about everybody here is quite familiar. It is because of Yeshua, therefore, that I can say unequivocally, not all good things come to an end. The most important good thing that God has given us is life. And while it may appear to come to an end, it will actually restart. Life doesn't end for us at a funeral, at the grave. You see, resurrection is coming. Now, this morning, I want to share a few things with you about that. Many believers have the think that the idea of resurrection was really a New Testament invention. That we really didn't hear about it. Why didn't we hear about it if it was, such an important thing here, which is clearly pretty important? Kind of changes everything, doesn't it? Why didn't we hear about that before? Why is it that it seems like it's a new thing that happened and was revealed in the New Testament? Is that really the case? Not true. It is not true that it's a New Testament invention. I want to share with you this morning, therefore, a number of examples from the Tanakh, which is the way the Hebrew Scriptures are called, and some know of them. I've heard them called the Old Testament, but we prefer here at a Messianic congregation to call them the Tanakh, which is an abbreviation of the Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, the writings, the law of the prophets, and the writings, as they call. I want to share with you some examples to show you that this is not a New Testament invention. I'm going to start with a series of references from the Tanakh and begin with one in Job chapter 4. And I'm going to ask you to just kind of sit back and just kind of let these words flow over you as you hear them. You've hopefully heard them before. You may not have heard them recently, but I want to share a number of them with you. And I think when we have looked at all of these, your opinion will be changed as mine was when I first read about these. In Job, I begin with Job chapter 14, verse 12, where we read, "So a man lies down and does not rise until," and that's until the heavens are no longer. He will not awake nor be aroused out of his sleep. Oh, that you would hide me in Sheol, the place of the dead in the Tanakh, that you would conceal me until your wrath returns to you, that you would set a limit for me and remember me. Why? If a man dies, will he live again? All the days of my struggle, I will wait until my change comes. You will call and someone else? No. I will answer you. You will long for the work of your hands. Notice he says, I will answer you. Not somebody else for you. And not somebody else that's kind of like you, but you. I will answer. See, you are the work of God's hands. Again in Job chapter 19, beginning in verse 25, we read, As for me, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will take his stand on earth. I understand that. Where do I fit into it? Even after my skin is destroyed, yet from my flesh I shall see God. This is the God whom I myself shall behold, and whom my eyes will see, and not another. My heart faints within me, overwhelmed, as Job, when these words were written, overwhelmed to think that thought. Psalm chapter 16, verses 9 through 11. Therefore, my heart is glad and my glory rejoices. Why? My flesh will also dwell securely. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to undergo decay. This is a verse, by the way, which is familiar to a lot of you, that's quoted all the time about Yeshua. But it applies, the first part of it applies to you and me. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol. The Holy One refers to Yeshua. You will make known to me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. In your right hand there are pleasures for a while. No, I don't think so. Pleasures forever. Psalm 17, verse 15. As for me, I shall behold your face in righteousness, the Lord. I will be satisfied with your likeness when I awake. Psalm 49, verse 15. But God will redeem my soul from the power of Sheol, for he will receive me. Isaiah, you getting tired? We're not done yet. I could go. Isaiah 25, verse 8. He will swallow up death for all time, and the Lord God will wipe tears away from all faces. Some of this sound familiar? And he will remove the reproach of his people from all the earth. For the Lord has spoken. He will swallow up death for all time. Just think about it. And it's not that he's going to swallow up all the death to come there after us. All death that has happened. Isaiah 26:19. Look at the variety of prophets who spoke about this issue. Your dead will live. Your dead will live. Their corpses will rise. How much clearer could it possibly be? You who lie in the dust, awake and shout for joy, For your dew is as the dew of the dawn, and the earth will do what? Give birth to the departed spirits. We go on. Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 says, many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. Well, who's left? Everybody's coming back here, folks. It's just a matter of where you end up spending that time. And one more example from chapter 12 in Daniel chapter verse 13. But as for you, go your way to the end. Then you will enter into rest and do what? Rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age. There are other examples, and we could be here much longer, but I thought these would be clear enough to make the point. The prophets talked about this. The Old Testament prophets talked about them. Resurrection was not an invention of the New Testament. It was, in fact, could rightfully be said, based on all that I've read for you just here right now, a prophetic expectation in the Tanakh. This was not just one or two prophets, as you saw. Many of the writing prophets, and probably those who didn't write, spoke of it. So, if you're here this morning, you might say, well, that's nice. So why are we talking about resurrection this morning? And the answer is because we are studying the book of 1 Corinthians, a letter that Paul wrote to a congregation in Corinth. And we ran into, in our study, what I think was a very surprising verse in chapter 15. By now you probably have this verse memorized, right? Here's the verse that was surprising. Now in verse 12 and 15, in chapter 15. Now if Messiah is preached that he has been raised from the dead, how do some among you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? He's addressing these to believers. How could believers, some of them, apparently because the word of some is there, he doesn't say that all of you, how do all of you, that some among you say that there is no. How is that? If Messiah is, we've preached and you have believed, he has said, and you have accepted by faith what we have shared with you, how then do some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? All right, so I want to take a look at that particular phrase. There is no resurrection of the dead. And I'm going to look at this phrase, and if you really stop and try to be as fair about it and as objective about it as you possibly can be, I came up with four possibilities. There are four possible ways to take this phrase, that there is no resurrection of the dead. Four ways to take it, okay? It's not just, may seem obvious to you one way to take it, but if you really stop and think about it, the Corinthians may have taken it different ways, okay? Here's one. They may think that no one has been or ever can be resurrected from the dead. They just reject resurrection entirely. Seems a little inconsistent, but that's what they say. That's one way to interpret. That's maybe the obvious way to take it. Or there's another way to take it. They could mean, well, we preached Messiah was raised. Okay, we'll accept that. Okay, only Yeshua was and will be resurrected from the dead. Maybe you meant that. That's a second way to understand it. This is a very creative way to understand it, to research on this one. That some believe, perhaps, his raising, when it says Yeshua was raised, that was really discussing his exaltation to heaven. It wasn't the bodily resurrection. It was when he was lifted up, ascended to the Lord. That's when he was raised. And here's a fourth one. I don't understand this. I don't get it. How can a body from the earth, a terrestrial body, be raised to live up in a heavenly celestial home? How could that possibly be? So I'm not buying it, because I don't understand that. Well, you look at the first one. No one has been or can be resurrected from the dead. Right away, what should jump to your mind if somebody said that? What should jump to your mind? Pause for a moment and say, well, how would I respond to that? I said, no, there is no resurrection. Let me offer this thought. This denies all the eyewitness accounts. These are eyewitnesses who saw this, and not just one or two. And one of the references that the Apostle Paul talks about, over 500, many of which are still alive, he says at the time he wrote it, saw the resurrected Lord. So if you take that position, number one, right away you're discounting all the eyewitnesses of events. Only Yeshua being resurrected, well, that denies all of his promises. Everything he promised. He who believes in me will have eternal life. If he who has the Son has life. Who has not the Son of God has not life. That 1 John wrote, and 1 John. Everything he said, trust in me. All of those things, he's talking about you. He wasn't talking only about him. That denies Yeshua's promises. This third one, this very creative one, this is a very creative thought. I didn't come up with this one, but I read about it. His raising with his exaltation to heaven was his exaltation, not a bodily resurrection. That's one of those twisted theologies, and there are many. This is what is called in theological circles an over-realized eschatology. Eschatology means to study the end times. This is something that says, the end times are now. We are actually in the end times, and we're now experiencing, well, in some ways we are. I mean, who knows? The Lord will come back tomorrow. The end times begin when Yeshua was crucified and ascended. And so this is the understanding that his exaltation, his raising was the exaltation of heaven. This is the very kind of thing that grew up within 100 years of the actual event of Yeshua's ascension. And was actually people who espoused this position were the forerunners in the second century of the Gnostics, the people who said it's only knowledge, it didn't really happen physically, it was only a spiritual thing, and you need to know about it. Just being aware of it is the important thing. It's not a physical thing. They believed that they were already raised. How about that? They were already raised because they were participating in the sacraments, the communion and the immersion, the baptism, the two sacraments of the church. They already believe that they are experiencing the exaltation here on earth. Really, last time I looked around here, this is not a place that really looks a lot like heaven to me. At least I hope heaven doesn't look like this. I don't think it looked a whole lot better in those days when Rome was controlling everything. And so, what were they thinking? And finally, this position denies all the eyewitness accounts, not just of seeing him, but of a bodily resurrection, which is key, not just spiritual. So, how did the Apostle Paul take this concern? Which one of these did he take? Well, from what we see following, we can conclude that he discarded the first three right away, and he addressed this one. Oh, you don't get it? Let me explain how it works. That's okay that you don't get it. You think that there's no resurrection because you can't understand how something on earth could possibly connect with something in heaven. It doesn't seem like it's going to fit. So we begin this morning by looking at the text in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 35. as we move ahead. You know, this entire chapter, I have been looking forward to. I mentioned this in other messages before, because chapter 15 is, I mean, you just can sit there and soak all the time. I mean, it's just so much in there. And it's all about the resurrection. 58 verses in chapter 15. We are more than halfway through 15. And beginning at verse 35, we read this text. But someone will say, now notice the someone, he's not saying, but some of you. He's not doing that. He's not personalizing, he's not putting you in there. Someone, some objectors might say, how are the dead raised? And with what kind of body do they come? See, they don't understand resurrection. It doesn't make sense to them. And so they're asking this kind of a question, might be asked. So he's proposing. Paul's very good at this. He doesn't want to offend them and say, some of you out here might be thinking that. And if that had he made that accusation, some people might have said, well, you know, we wrote to you a problem here, and now you're really not a very dignified response here, because in the very next phrase he addresses those people as, you fool. Not a very term of endearment. You fool, that which you sow does not come to life unless it dies. That which you plant, now this is an agricultural society, right? But we've all planted things. Many of us used to have green front lawns, not so much anymore. But you know how to plant and make things grow and so on. But you know that when you plant something, you sow something. In this case, they're talking now about probably fruit or grain or something like that. That which you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And that which you sow, you do not sow the body, which is to be, but a bare grain, like a seed, a kernel, which is what the Greek word is for bare grain. You do not sow the body, but a bare grain, a seed perhaps of wheat or something else. That's what you put in the ground. But what grows up? God gives it what Paul is calling a body, just as he wished. And to each of the seeds, a body of its own. And the body doesn't really look a lot like the seed, does it? It really doesn't. All flesh is not the same flesh. But there is one flesh of men and another flesh of beasts and another flesh of birds and another of fish. He's saying, you know what? God has created all these different types of creatures. Starting with men and working his way down to fish. And he's giving examples. Paul is giving examples of saying, look at the variety of things that God can create. But notice the way he creates all of them. They don't start out like they end up looking. There are also, he says, now he goes off the planet, he's talking, there are also heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory, and I submit to you that when he uses the word glory in many of these passages, substitute in your mind the word brightness, the appearance, the glory is thinking of the visual appearance. But the glory of the heavenly is one, and the glory of the earthly is another. They're very different. You look at things, the sun doesn't look a lot like the earth, does it? There's one glory, he says, of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory, think again of brightness, and another glory of the stars, for stars differs from star in glory. He's just pointing, Paul is, to the variety of God's creation. How God has made all these different, some of them alive, some of them not alive, things in this universe. Well, he's made all these things, showing you the creativity that God has. He made many things. They didn't just happen, as some people want to suggest. Boy, I'm so tempted here. Where's Jack? We are really, this would be a great opportunity to talk about God's creation, that these things didn't just happen, by accident. Even the other stars and things that in this universe, I mean, it is stunning if you really stop and study some of the things that God has created, how big the universe is and how the stars have been it's just marvelous to see what he has done in his handiwork. He has done so much. And here we are on this little planet, and we get a chance to see it. It's pretty amazing. But he's made all these things. And they're different. How about that? God seems to like diversity, kind of into that. He creates different bodies, lots of different types. No two of you are alike. Yeah. I've just brought to mind a poem that I learned as a child, but I won't put it. It would be a good one to put in here about twins. Anybody ever heard of Ogden Nash? You have any okay, you have. Familiar with his poem, "The Twins" by Ogden Nash? Look it up sometime. Yeah, not that one. Oh, it is a great poem. If you can find it on the web, I'm sure. "The Twins" by Ogden Nash. Don't look at it now. So also is the resurrection of the dead, that he has created these things, and he also has the power not just to create the stars, the earth, and all the things you see around the moon and all these other things. He has also the power to resurrect the dead. And now he's going to explain how that looks. He says, it is sown, the things that you put in there, the body is sown a perishable body. And the word here is God is creating. God creates a perishable body. No, I'm looking in the mirror, I'm watching it, it's on its way. Every morning another wrinkle. It'd be really disappointing if it wasn't, God has a plan. It is sown a perishable body. But when it is resurrected, whatever it is imperishable. Just pause and think about that. We're so used to things coming to an end. What the body is God's design is imperishable. And Yeshua wasn't the only one who had a body that could have been like that. Adam had one before he sinned, didn't he? It wasn't until he sinned that all of a sudden the curse came, and then he died. He didn't die that day, but the promise of death actually came. It is sown a perishable and raised an imperishable. It begins as a perishable, but transformed by God, it becomes an imperishable. That is what he's getting at. Notice there's the body in here. Notice the emphasis about body everywhere. Now you'll see. Yeshua was the first. He was, of course, and we should look to him, and I'm going to pause here. He was the first and the only person that experienced a resurrected body. And we can learn from that as we try to understand what Paul is saying in this passage. We can learn. What do we learn? First of all, the references in the gospel account says in Luke chapter 24, verse 39, that he wasn't just a spirit, a ghost. When he came to the disciples, he said, "See my hands and my feet." He was talking to Thomas. See my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see. For a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have. It wasn't just a spiritual rising. See, this is part of the misunderstanding that the people are having. How is it that there is a resurrection? It was not just a spirit. Touch and find out. In John chapter 20, verse 27, speaking to Thomas the doubter, right? And then he said to Thomas, reach here with your finger and see with your eyes my hands. Look what they look like. You know what's happened to them. And reach here your hand and put it into my side. And do not be unbelieving, but believing. This is not, you can't touch a ghost. The point was, it was a physical resurrection. The body was one you could touch and feel and see and talk with. Philippians says that Yeshua would do that this was the promise to you. Yeshua, he said, when Paul wrote to the Philippians, Yeshua, who will transform the body of our humble state into conformity with the body of his own glory, by the exertion of the power that he has, even to subject all things to himself. By virtue of the power that he has, he will transform the body of our humble state now, and you'll see why it's humble, into a body of his glory. After his resurrection, there are some things that we can observe and should observe, based on the fact that there was this man who lived among people and grew up among them, now has died and been resurrected, and for 40 days, according to the book of Acts, he stayed amongst the people and talked with many and lived for another 40 days with them after his resurrection. He had a human body. Mary, thought him a gardener when she first saw him. What does that tell you? He wasn't 12 feet tall, nor was he a foot and a half. He had a human body. He looked normal. She thought he was just a gardener. He was recognizable. Eventually, she looked at him and said, oh, she heard his voice. She listened and said, oh, Yeshua. And she wanted to hug him. Story there we won't get into. Thomas recognized him, my Lord and my God. The disciples on the road to Emmaus, who were walking with him and talking with him and didn't really recognize him until he opened their eyes and they saw. They realized. And then it says, and then he vanished from their sight. So there are some things a little different. Many examples, we won't take the time to go through them, how he was recognizable. But he could communicate with humans. That means he could hear. His ears were working. And he could speak and you could hear him. If you were standing right there, you would have heard him. He even remembered, in his resurrected form, the names of the people who were his friends. He knew them. Peter, John, what's it to you, Peter? What's it to you if John lives longer than you? I mean, he talked to the people. He knew them. Thomas, don't remember. And he was able to function in an earthly environment. Wow, that sounds very human to me. He breathed oxygen. He got tired probably slept. Got up in the morning. Acted like a human because in a lot of ways he still was. Paul goes on to say that this perishable body, that the things that God created, it was sown. Your body was sown, given to you, originated in dishonor, and yet is raised in glory. What does he mean by that? I take that to mean that you were sown, you were created in sin did my mother conceive me, right? Sin did my father conceive me. This is what we were born with since the fall. We've all inherited the sin nature. So we started out sinful. But now we are going to be raised sinless. God is going to cleanse all that sin from you so that when you are raised in the resurrection, you will be sinless. There's more. I got good things coming. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. What does that mean? It is sown fleshly. You don't have the strength or the character to be able to avoid sinning tomorrow or maybe in the next minute. It is sown in weakness, fleshly, but it is raised, filled with the Spirit. That's an awesome thought. You have the Spirit now, but you still sin. Why is that? Because your sin nature is still hanging on. I wish it wasn't. Don't you? But it does. That's why we still sin. You have the power not to, but you don't have the power, the willpower, because of the nature that's on you. You're going to fall again tomorrow. But don't give up. You will be raised with the Spirit, and you will have the power then. It is sown a natural body, and it has raised a spiritual one. It's created a body that only works on the earth. But it will be raised a spiritual, not a spirit, but a spiritual body. A body which is spiritual, which has capabilities beyond the one that you have now. A heavenly body. And finally, he says, if there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. When he uses the word if in this case, he's really saying, since there is a natural body, we know that in the resurrection, you will have also a spiritual body. Now, okay, so he's given us some things, but they're pretty general. Let's try to put this together and see what we can take away from this whole thing. What do we know about the resurrection based on what Paul has just told us? Well, we know this. Number one, it's not just going to be a spiritual. You will have a body. Oh, that's nice. What's it going to look like, Paul? Well, it's going to be a little different from the one you have. It'll be a heavenly body. We're all smiling, thinking what that's going to be. It won't be an earthly body. And it will be imperishable. I think it's going to look like you do. Yeshua looked like Yeshua. I know that seems crazy just to think about that. But he was the divine man. And when the wraps were taken off, he looked very different. Last time I checked, none of you were divine. So I don't imagine that you're going to look quite like him in that, but you'll be able to see him, right? Just as he is. You will be recognizable, just like Yeshua was recognizable. We won't need name tags. I was thinking about that. That was I don't know if that's good or bad, but I think that that's the plan. We will be recognizable, and you will remember your earthly life and your friends and your experiences here. That's going to be interesting to deal with that. But Yeshua remembered all that had gone on. Lastly, if you are a believer, this applies to you based on what we've learned. If you are a believer, you will be able to resist sin. Your sin nature will have been removed from you. You will finally be cleansed. By virtue of the Holy Spirit, you will then actually no longer sin. I know that's hard to believe. As I look around, I can see why. No. I'm looking in the mirror too. Because of that, you will actually be able to do the things that you really know you should do, and you will want to do them. He's not telling us everything, but finally, you will see the Lord face to face. What are you going to say? Hello? Nice to meet you in person. Think about that conversation. I don't know what that's going to be like. He will meet you, and you will meet him. And it will be in the flesh of some kind. So, are you ready? I don't know about you, but as the days are moving on, I'm looking forward to that. Let's close in prayer. Father, thank you for the promise of resurrection that we have before us, and not just an ethereal thing, Lord, but this is a real bodily resurrection. We'll know one another. We'll remember things. We'll be able to communicate. It'll be different, but it'll yet be similar to what we have here. All the problems that we have due to the sin nature that we have in this world will be ended. And those who unfortunately, Lord, have not embraced you will not be there to cause trouble. And Lord, we will be in your presence. Not that we aren't in your presence now, but in your physical presence. And that will be something that will not come to an end. And although we see dimly now, we look forward to that moment. In fact, that eternity that begins when you resurrect us. That's the promise we have. And Lord, that changes everything, doesn't it? It really does. Thank you for that, Lord. We have no words. There's nothing we can say, nothing we can do except to express our appreciation even right now from inside of us, each and every person here who has that to look forward to. We're all thanking you right at this moment and looking forward to that. We pray these things in the name of that Messiah who made all of that possible, as he gave his life for us that we might have life, eternal life, abundant life, much more than we have here. And we give you all the praise and thanks for that in his precious name. Amen.